Hey everybody, it's Kirsten. Today I wanted to bless you with an update on my caster Infernalist. Ever since the Infernalist class was announced, it became very obvious that the class will have some major downsides in both Infernal Pact and Demon form that will have to be overcome in some way in order to make the best use of the class. The class was an awesome puzzle to take on, and I finally feel like I'm at a place where we've managed to turn around the major downside of Infernal Pact into an upside. And that's when the class truly shines. Here's some gameplay footage versus a third level difficulty boss. And I mean, this boss goes in and out of invulnerability a lot, so it's kind of annoying to work with. But still, it showcases the strengths of the build quite well. So just to highlight, the DPS of the build is amazing. The survivability is top notch because we're running 700 life per second regeneration. On top of that, we have 2,500 per second energy shield regen flasks. We have 90% fire res, 70% fizz damage mitigation, max res on all the other resistances, including 77 max on cold and lightning. 20% of cold and lightning gets rerouted to fire, so that damage mitigation is even better. And that's with only 6 ascendancy points. We're running max crit with ridiculous crit damage bonuses. We're technically low life, so we have Pain Attunement for even more crit. And honestly, we're just getting started. We have a lot of item slots that we can make major improvements to. So let me walk you through the build guide. Irashaimase! Alright, so the concept behind this build is to turn the downside of Pyromantic Pact, which, as you can see, take maximum life and energy shield does fire damage when Infernal Flame reaches max. Basically, whenever that happens, to turn that downside of taking damage into an upside. We essentially turn it into a battery for fueling casts through Barrier Invocation Comet. So we use Eye of Winter, a very expensive one, 616 mana cost, to get our energy shield hit. And then that procs, as you can see top left, Barrier Invocation, which then can dump a whole lot of comets, or you can just dump comets freely as you walk around. And you don't need to crit anything. It's much better than cast on crit in that way. You can preload it for boss fights, and if you have sufficient meta skill energy generation, you can turn this into almost just free casting without even casting Eye of Winter, just pure comet after comet after comet. But we're not quite there yet with this build, so let me show you where we are. Let's talk about the skill gems first. The 5-link Barrier Invocation, we've got Comet, obviously, as high level as you can. The mana cost does not impact us. Spell Echo is by far the best option here. Then we have Impetus for extra energy generation, and Capacitor. Capacitor is a must-have. Without it, the build is going to be very awkward. It's even more important than Impetus. You can see that I'm running 141% energy gain modifier, 40 of it coming from Impetus. Max energy is 900. So this is the most important skill part of the build. And you'll notice with 20% quality, Comet actually has a 15% flat crit. Then we run Eye of Winter. This is our spam skill that procs our self damage, but also applies critical weakness. So that's going to take out the critical hit chance from 15 flat to 25 flat crit on Comet, which means we only need to have an additional 300% increase spell crit chance to hit max crit. It's super easy to hit max crit with Comet together with that of Winter. And later on in the guide, you'll see all of the crit damage multipliers that we're going to get. And so for Eye of Winter, we just have mobility. This is quite nice. 30% less movement speed penalty. They just nerfed this support skill for what we're using it for, but it's not a big deal. Arcane Tempo for faster cast speed. And then we also have Unleash, because we don't really care about the DPS from Eye of Winter. We care about the critical weaknesses being applied. So by having Unleash, we can apply more critical weaknesses against bosses. We have Hypothermia on swap. So if you see, we swap to a staff. I don't like the staff swap, and I'll explain why in a second. But I'll probably change that to a wand and shield, same shield as I have right now. The support gems, we have Heightened Curse, Persistence, and Focused Curse. Heightened Curse is the most important one here. These two, well, Persistence is quite nice actually versus longer boss fights. Blink is a very nice mobility skill. We have Vitality. For this build, as you can see, we have 700 life recovery per second from regen. So Vitality is very nice. I don't want to say must have, but it's a very good skill to have for this build. Ingenuity for better cooldown for the blink. And then we also run Herbalism. As I mentioned, we get 2.2 thousand energy shield per second flasks. Here, I'll show you real quick. So you can see 2.2 thousand energy shield per second recovered. And that's for, it's going to be for about 4 seconds. And that's why we run Herbalism for even better energy shield flasks. And finally, we have Frost Wall. I don't really use it. You can sometimes pop it on top of bosses to speed up the freeze buildup. You can see I have more freeze and longer freeze duration. So sometimes it can be used to create separation between you and a pack of enemies. But honestly, we're so tanky and we kill everything so fast. Frost Wall isn't really necessary. I also have Arctic Armor. We have tons of Spirit because of our Ascendancy. And so with the leftover Spirit, we are running Arctic Armor. At 6 stages, that's 3000 cold damage, which is not bad. It's about a comet. If something hits you, they get hit by a comet worth of damage, and likely they're going to freeze or die. Cold Mastery for it. I don't know what else to put in here, honestly. Knock back enemies on hit. Cannibalism, extra life recovery. Honestly, yeah, these, I don't know what to do with the extra spirit here. These are not super high value, but you have 45 spirit that you can work with. Even an extra 15 here, so you could fit a 60 spirit worth of support skill gems here if you wanted. So you could customize the build a bit for what fits for you, because honestly this is not super high value. Herbalism I'd say is nice, and Vitality is nice, but you could take them out. They're not must have. I would love to run Alchemist's Boon. Once I get enough spirit and dexterity, I think I need 133 at level 14 to be able to equip Alchemist's Boon. And it's going to give us 0.2 flask charges per second. That is nice considering how much value we get out of the flask charges. But let me go through the items and the passives first before we get a little bit deeper into potential upgrades to the build. So in terms of items, there are 3 must-have items. This shield right here, you can see it gives us 5 max fire res, and because of Pyromantic Pact dealing fire damage to us, we really have to be running 90% fire res. Without 90% fire res, I don't think the build is as good. We're also mitigating cold and lightning damage by rerouting them to fire. We're also rerouting 46 up to maybe even 49% fizz damage into fire damage. So having 90% fire res not only enables a lot of our survivability, but it mitigates stupid amounts of damage coming in from monsters as well. So Rise of the Phoenix, Cloak of Flame, and Coward's Legacy. These 3 items make for an insane combo. You can see Coward's Legacy, given this Ascendancy here reserving 25% life to give us spirit, we are always at 75% life or less, which makes Coward's Legacy, you count as low life while at 75% of max life or below. That is always on. We are always at low life. So this shield gives us 5% max fire, 57 fire res, and 6.95% life per second. Insane value. Cloak of Flame is mainly for the fizz damage mitigation. With these 3 items online, you have a lot of flexibility. You can spec into Spark, Firewall, Comet. You can spec into Eye of Winter, Comet. You have quite a few options. So you can see I've opted for lots of cold spell skills and then a bit of damage, extra cold damage even. I would ideally have that as extra lightning damage for the shock. Crit hit chance is amazing. And keep in mind, we don't really care about the mana roll. And right now, the most expensive stuff comes with mana roll because there are just infinitely many Archmage classes running around. So we get the cheaper items because we don't care about mana. In the other gear, I try to get as much life as possible. Check out this amulet here. It has 7% max life, scaled with the quality life modifiers from Breach. It also has a tier 9 max life, plus 3 spell skills, of course. And then for the suffixes, you can do whatever you want. This one happens to have mana. We don't really need the mana, but In certain cases, it can be nice. In certain cases, it can actually be a negative. At some point, I'm going to fine tune the exact amount of mana I want to have. But first, we need to get to like level 20 skill gems, etc. For the helmet, I recommend just triple res life and then as much energy shield as possible. The energy shield in the helmet is quite important since we cannot really have too many other sources of energy shield. You can run a breach ring with, again, life and life regen, and then you can quality the life. Both of those are going to benefit. Cast speed and rarity here are all right. I would ideally like it to have some res on it, but this one is all right. This ring is currently my weakest point. I would like to replace it with something that has a lot of life on it. It doesn't have to be breach ring necessarily, but something that addresses my resistance issues while also giving me a ton of life. Boots are pretty straightforward. Res, life, move speed. Gloves, same thing, straightforward. Res, life is the only thing that you really care. Get as much energy shield as you can from these two slots. Ideally, I would like to take my energy shield by up to about 2,000 or so, because as you can see, the flask that we are using is very important as well. 90% more recovery if used while on low life. That is huge for this build. Again, we're always low life, and more means that it's multiplicative. That's how we get 2.2 thousand energy shield per second recovered with the flask. And that we're going to scale up even higher, by the way. So for the suffix on the life flask, I would recommend either reduce charges on use or 0.25 charges per second. So the passive skill tree looks kind of interesting. We avoid everything really, just one value point here in pure energy. And then we beeline to the edge of the passive tree. Here, even then, we still avoid most nodes. We take a bit of int and a bit of crazy high value max energy shield here, 75% for 2 points. Then obviously lots of jewel slots. And I actually like these 3 points here for the extra cold damage, extra freeze buildup, but also hits ignore non-negative elemental resistances of frozen enemies. We freeze enemies pretty much instantly with comets. It just hits, even bosses get frozen pretty quickly. And then the extra damage with hits against frozen enemies is nice as well. And then this is one of the biggest benefits of this build is having eternal youth. Life recovery from flasks applies to energy shield instead. That's how we get 2.2 thousand energy shield per second. On this side, you'll see we also run Zealot's Oath. So the recharge stuff we really don't care about. So we're rerouting all of life recovery and flask recovery into energy shield thanks to these two keynotes. We take a bit of extra value here and notice 20% cast speed while on low life. This is just crazy value right here. We also get another 16, so 36 cast speed off of just 2 points. The increase in mana cost we truly don't care about because we even want higher mana cost to proc more Infernal Flame self-damage. These are very high value nodes here, even though there are 3 small nodes to take. 20% crit, 40% ele damage. Very, very high value if you compare it to some of the other crit chance nodes that you can take. Like compare it to this one, for example, 25 crit chance. That's it. That's all you get. This is a lot better. And then we have 5% all res and 30 elemental damage. Going down along this side of the tree, Pain Attunement. Again, we're running low life, so we get 30% more crit. So if we have 100% crit chance, this is super high value. Prism Guard here, if you do the math, between 3 max fire res here, 5 max fire res from the shield, that's 8. Here we have 1 more point, that's 9. Which means that all we need from Unnatural Resilience is 6 extra to take us from 75 max to 90% max fire res. Which means we just need 120 fire res to be res capped on fire. And then we have the highest value crit chance and crit damage passive cluster in the game. Comes with the downside of reduced max mana and increased mana cost of skills, which is a downside that we don't care about. And the rest of the skill tree is really all life regen. That's all we take. Here we can take 45 life regen, 15 of which is life recovery, which applies to potions as well, by the way. And then here we have 45 life regen while on low life. That is super high value again. 1.5% of life per second while on low life. And if you're doing the math, we're talking about 7% here, 8.5 with this, 9.5% of our life pool with vitality, And potentially, if we have 100% uptime on stand ground, that's 10.5% of our life pool recovered per second. That's before life regeneration rate bonuses from various gears. Not only that, Desperate Times also gives us 40% life recovery from flasks when used on low life, which is always. So 40% life recovery, that's pretty sweet. And you can see next, I'm actually going towards Heavy Drinker. 30% increase flask effect duration, plus another 10 here. That's going to take our flasks from 3 seconds to 4.2 seconds. On top of that, it gives us 5% of life recovered when you use a life flask while on low life. And that gets boosted by Hell Hard as well. So it's 5.75. So that's going to be my next 2 points at level 93. I'll hit that. And then you can see anytime there is a jewel socket within 2, I want to say points reach, I always take that. If it's 3 points away, it's a bit harder to justify, but 2 points I think is a very high value. For the Anoint, I have Hard to Kill. This is one of the best value Anoints you're going to get for this build. It costs less than an Exalt. If you look at the distilled emotions that you require, Guilt, Greed, Guilt, that is super cheap. And it gives us 40% increased flask life recovery rate and 0.75 life per second. So if you add that to the 10.5 we had, that is 11.25% life per second recovered. And here we have a bit more health regen, 30% life regen. For Stand Ground, it has 2 different benefits. The 1% life per second while affected by damaging ailments. If we go for Grinning Immolation, we are essentially going to be ignited at all times. And keep in mind that we are only going to take 10% of the ignite damage. So we're going to be taking 1.5% of our life and energy shield as fire damage per second. Given that this is going to recover 1% of life per second, scaled up to, let's say, maybe 2.5%, these two should essentially cancel out. So whenever we're ignited, Stand Ground kicks in and the downside of the ignite is mitigated. We also have 1% of life per second while stationary. So whenever you get frozen or stunned, that's going to kick in. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been frozen for like 4 seconds. And I've survived through it with like 10, 20 enemies wailing on me with just potion recovering my energy shield and stuff like that. The build is insanely tanky because of all the regen that we have. So if you sum up all the life regen, we have 30 and then 75 and then 120 life regen between these 3 clusters. And we also have one more 10% life regen point here as well, if we happen to get it at a higher level. But that puts us at about 24-25% of our life total recovered per second. And that is essentially going to fuel our comets. We can convert life regen per second into comets per second. So let's do the math on that. If we pull up our trusty cast on critical, rip cast on crit, and if we just put the comet there just for science purposes, you can see that a single comet is 300 max energy. So if we go back to Barrier Invocation, it has a max energy of 900, which should be exactly 3 comets, 3 times 300, right? So you can see we're going from 100% Barrier Invocation capacity. 3 comets goes down to 0 and then back up to 19% because the 3 comets procced my Infernal Flame 1 time. So a single comet requires 300 energy to be generated. Hit damage required to gain 1 energy is 5. Therefore, to gain 300 energy, we need to take 1500 shield damage. However, we have an energy gain modifier of 141. So we can divide that 1500 by 2.41. And the result is that we need to take 622 energy shield damage to proc 1 comet. So 700 life recovery per second is 1 comet per second. Assuming we don't need the life for, survival purposes. And then the cool part is when we activate the health potion, that is an extra 2200 energy shield per second. So altogether, we're running about 4 comets per second in that state. So here's the neat part. You can theoretically make it so that your comets cost enough mana to proc your Infernal Flame, every single comet. And then you can do the math such that every single Infernal Flame proc gives you exactly 300 energy in Barrier Invocation. So you can make it so that every single comet fuels another comet, assuming that you have sufficient energy regen. So the ultimate end state of the build is to get the energy gain modifier high enough, as well as our health pool high enough, and our mana pool just the right amount, so that the spell casting of comets with the right click generates more comets, and so we can just hold right click and not even cast Eye of Winter. Eye of Winter is only something that we want to cast for application of critical weakness. We don't really want to spam it as much, even though it's decent damage. It's just not as efficient of a way of utilizing our Infernal Flame. So that's something I'm going to be optimizing around. I'm going to be min-maxing the energy gain modifier, and I'm going to be min-maxing my total health pool, my total energy shield pool, to make this a lot smoother. Currently, it's already very smooth. We can tank through tier 15 maps quite easily. We can even stand in some of the nastiest ground dot effects in the game and just shrug them off. The rough math comes out to, if you have an energy gain modifier of 200%, that means every 500 energy shield damage is going to be a comet. And so if you have a total life plus energy pool of 5,000, that's a comet every time you proc Infernal Flame. So currently you can see we have about 3.6k. So we need to raise it up by another 1.4 thousand, which is very doable, by the way. I'm in the process of changing all of these sockets, for example, to 2% life. You can see this is already running 2% life. This is 2% life. So if we get another 8% life, plus life in the ring, higher life in the gloves, higher life in the boots, after those 4 life improvements are done, that's roughly where I expect us to land at the end. 3.5k life, 1.5k energy shield. And so that's going to give us life recovery very close to 1,000 per second. The life flasks are going to be another 2.5 thousand per second. And so we're going to be running 3.5 thousand energy shield per second, which is 7 comets per second, all of them at max crit. Now, let's talk about the crit. This build has so much potential for upside. If you get Grinning Immolation, the 30% more crit multi, that should be multiplicative with Pain Attunement's 30% more crit multi. And then we can run as much crit multi as we can across the tree. The best way to scale crit damage is through the jewels, obviously. Ideally, we probably want to have 20% crit damage in every single jewel. As you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 9 jewel slots in total is what we're running right now. And by level 100, we can consider putting a 100th jewel slot, even though there's just so many good places to go down the tree, given how spread out we are. But yeah, 9 jewel slots. If we can get 20% crit damage in all of them, that's 180. We can consider running Charge Infusion. Even at level 20, we have enough dexterity. And that would give us 20% more critical hit chance at level 20. So that would take Comet from 25% flat to 30% flat, essentially. Then we would only need 235 increased crit chance to hit max crit on Comet. And that could open up running Super Critical as our 6th link on Barrier Invocation. Sadly, it's only 100% increase, not more critical damage bonus. But it's still probably decent damage, given that we have 30% more multipliers. We can consider running Magnified Effect. That's a decent option. Even Deep Freeze is actually a pretty decent option for Comet. 50% increased freeze duration on bosses. That's going to be pretty sweet. And if we just run out of ideas, there's always Cold Mastery to consider. So those are the options I would consider for the 6th link on Barrier Invocation. There's also one that gives back energy with, like, I don't know, 25% chance to give half the energy for Barrier Invocation on use. I'm not a huge fan of that one. I think I would rather go for damage or AoE. If you don't feel like you need the extra damage from Grinning Immolation, or your crit chance is not as high as you'd like it to be yet, you can always consider running a Loyal Hellhound. That's going to take 20% of the damage from hits though. So you have to keep in mind that you're probably going to end up killing your Loyal Hellhound with the self damage literally all the time. So you're probably going to have to run Last Gasp. And even then, I don't know how reliable it's going to be. You also have to keep in mind that all of a sudden, you're not going to be taking 10% of your life and energy shield on Infernal Flame proc. You're going to be taking 80% because the Loyal Hellhound is going to divert some of it to itself. So you have to just change your math a little bit on how you're running your Infernal Flame. There's going to be a little bit of volatility as well when the Loyal Hellhound, it might have a 4-second downtime. Even with Last Gasp, it should have a 4-second downtime. So that's something to consider. Other than that, recommendation for the passive tree, make sure to run a curse setup on the weapon swap. You just get so much out of it. These 4 clusters of curse nodes, they make the duration way higher, the effectiveness way higher. It's like 70 to 75% minus cold res on bosses. It's just way too valuable. Again, I would not go for the staff because you can see our health regen bricks. And not only that, Frostbite costs more than our mana pool. So just a single cast of Frostbite, or actually with the staff we actually have enough mana pool. But a single cast of Frostbite can easily proc the self damage. And given how low our life recovery per second is on the staff side, it's just a bit dangerous. So I'm not a huge fan of the staff, even though it's +7. I would rather run a +5 very basic wand with basically the same shield, just a second copy of this shield. So that way we don't lose too much of the life recovery, we don't lose too much sustain, and we don't end up dying because of swapping to cast a curse. It has happened to me in one boss fight. I can see maybe a case for getting these 5 points, +1 level to all cold skills, freeze buildup, and 20% freeze duration. Those are very nice for a 5-point investment. It's possible at some point that we no longer need cast speed. If that is the case, we can consider taking these 4 points out and routing them potentially into crit damage, maybe crit chance here to make crit capping even easier. I'm not sure. Haven't thought about it enough. But at some point, I do believe if we optimize the build enough, we will have not as much need for cast speed. It's just so hard to get rid of these because for 4 points, we get 41% cast speed. That's insane value. For annoyance other than hard to kill, honestly, hard to kill is amazing. I would stick with it for a very long time. Another consideration is, if you find that you do not need the extra spirit, you could take these 2 points out and put them into energy shield. Sorry, yeah, this one here, energy shield. Just keep in mind that the higher your energy shield is, the more self-damage you're going to take. So you have to find the right balance in terms of health, energy shield, and Infernal Flame. It's a very interesting class where there's a lot of fine-tuning in terms of just finding the perfect, most optimal balance of everything. Another crazy high-value node is climate change. 20% increase freeze buildup, 25% of cold damage as extra fire damage against frozen enemies. Considering how much we freeze, this is pretty high value. I wish I could take this node as well. I would even consider anointing this one. Hail Traveler is interesting, but not amazing. Only 0.1 charges per second. Lasting Concoctions could be interesting as well, given how important flasks are for this build. So 25% flask duration, 25% flask charges gained. So if you combo that up with good flask generation, let's say you have 0.45 per second, thanks to the suffix of the flasks, as well as Alchemist's Boon from the Ranger skill tree here, that can scale up kind of nicely. You can see the attributes that we're running are kind of awkward. Basically, I would run as much int just to satisfy int requirements, as much dexterity to satisfy dexterity requirements for the various skill gems that we're using, and then everything else into strength, because we just need a lot of life. The 105 dexterity requirement is coming from Barrier Invocation, level 19. The extra 3% energy gained per level can be decent, so we're trading 10 flat life for, let's say, 3% extra energy gained. Another option is to just keep your Barrier Invocation at a lower level. So Resilient Soul is another interesting passive to consider. 20% life regen, so that is very similar to Hard to Kill. It's just instead of flask, we get life. And then 5% of damage recouped as life. Unfortunately, that doesn't fit into the energy shield, but it's still, given how much damage we're going to be taking, still adds a little bit. And if you want to go the recoup life, shout out to Phil, by the way, who has been running a similar iteration of this building with great success. So you could also spend 4 points here to get 24 elemental damage, which we're taking fire damage. 24 of that fire damage as recoup as life. So that could be another layer of sustain, just to make it so that the recoup maxes out your life quickly, and then this 700 regen starts working on the energy shield right away. I think it's a very solid option. Going all in on the recoup side is a different build altogether. But even just getting 24% fire damage recoup for these 4 points is viable, I would say, and it could be a good option for that extra sustain. For drills, obviously you want crit chance, crit damage, energy shield, elemental damage, cold pen, area of effect is decent, meta energy generation. A lot of those are good options. I would even consider the red gems that give you fire res, life regeneration per second, and elemental damage. I would consider also green socketed gems that give you flask duration and flask effect, and then maybe elemental damage in the prefix. All of these are viable options for jewel sockets. And if you get fancy, there are some really expensive jewels to consider as well. I think I'll try to min-max around that later on as I get more currency. In terms of when to switch into this build, honestly, I would not recommend it until you're like level 75 to 80. You can see the passive tree is very spread out. There are many requirements to make the build work. Certainly, you cannot play without Zealot's Oath and without this extra fire res that we're getting here. And if you're running Zealot's Oath, you want a lot of this health regen. You could consider going into this side of the tree, the very last, the very end. So around level 80, before you get to this side, you can consider switching probably. But Eternal Youth is very high value. Make sure to anoint literally any amulet you have with hard to kill because it's dirt cheap to anoint that. For leveling to get to here, there are many options. Probably the best one is Spark, Firewall, and Ice Wall. That's what I was running earlier. And even running that, you benefit from stacking health regen because you essentially get infinite mana. Spark, if you get a lot of cast speed, it can guzzle up your mana even though it's a relatively low mana cost skill. And so having high health regen can mitigate that mana cost problem. And really you can run Spark Firewall from level 1. So you could level on from 1 to 75, 80-ish with Spark Firewall. Obviously stacking more and more health regen as you go along. And then when you get to the point where you have sufficient health regen and sufficient flask potency and sufficient itemization, you need the 3 items here, the cloak, the shield, and the belt. Once you have all of that and your res, fire res especially, you don't even consider running this before you get 90% fire res. I would not recommend it. But once you get to that point, you can switch over and everything will be super smooth. And now I'll leave you with some gameplay footage of a tier 15 map as we wrap up the build guide here. Tinkering with the Infernalist toys that we have has been so much fun. Especially with this build, I finally feel like I've been able to fine-tune something really powerful. We've got the damage side cover, the tankiness, the survivability, the sustain. All really important aspects of the build are really strong. Definitely give it a try. And I'm going to put a link to the build guide on Mobalytics so you can take a look at the passive tree if you need, as well as the skill gems that I currently have. And I'll try to update that build guide as changes happen. I apologize for not updating the cast and crit one, but it was just kind of dead after the patch, so not really any point to update it. I have high hopes for the build surviving a nerf patch or two. We'll see how it goes. But next, I'm going to be min-maxing my items a bit more, especially around getting as much life as possible from every single piece of gear. Getting that 2% life, 4 in every socket, getting the flask duration notable, and then I'm going to start testing the build against some of the harder bosses. I finally accumulated a breach stone today, so I'm going to be testing the build against the final breach boss, and I also should probably get my final ascendancy point one of these days. So if you've enjoyed this build guide and you're curious about this build and how it's going to progress forward, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and tune in. Anyway, I hope you try it out. Thank you so much for tuning in. Much love, take it easy, and go chisto, sama deshita.